The crowbar glinted in the pre-dawn darkness as Patricia Henley raised it above her head, metal scraping against concrete in a sound that would haunt the neighborhood for months to come. The wheelchair ramp that had stood at 1247 Maple Street for 3 years shuddered under the first blow. Then the second, wooden planks splintering like bones breaking in the cold morning air. Mrs. Dorothy Evans had been asleep in her bedroom when the destruction began, but the violent crashes jolted her awake at 4:47 a.m. She reached for her glasses with trembling fingers, arthritis making every movement a small battle, and listened to the sounds of her lifeline being torn apart. The ramp wasn't just wood and metal to her. It was freedom, independence, her only connection to the world beyond her front door. Patricia Henley, president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association and self-appointed guardian of property values, worked methodically in the darkness. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, her HOA badge gleaming on her navy blazer, even at this ungodly hour. She'd planned this moment for weeks, ever since the association's latest meeting, where her motion to remove unsightly accessibility modifications had been voted down by the more reasonable members. The ramp had been built by Mrs. Evans's son Michael 3 years ago, following her stroke and subsequent mobility issues. Every permit had been obtained, every regulation followed, every neighbor consulted. The gentle slope allowed her to navigate from her front door to the sidewalk in her wheelchair, making possible her twice-weekly trips to physical therapy, her monthly doctor appointments, and her cherished Sunday visits to St. Mary's Catholic Church. But Patricia saw only an eyesore, a deviation from the neighborhood's pristine uniformity. She'd complained about it at every HOA meeting, filed formal grievances, and made increasingly hostile visits to Mrs. Evans' home. The elderly woman had tried to reason with her, explaining her medical needs, showing her the city permits, even offering to paint the ramp to match her house's trim. Nothing satisfied Patricia's obsession with aesthetic perfection. Now, as the final pieces of the ramp crashed to the ground, Patricia felt a surge of satisfaction. She gathered the debris and loaded it into her SUV, making 3 trips to ensure every scrap was removed. By 6 a.m., the space where the ramp had stood was empty, except for the concrete anchor points, stark reminders of what had been lost. Mrs. Evans sat on the edge of her bed, understanding with growing horror what had happened. Without the ramp, she was trapped in her own home, a prisoner of Patricia's cruelty. Her wheelchair couldn't navigate the 3 concrete steps that led to her front door. They might as well have been mountains. As dawn broke over Willowbrook, neighbors began emerging from their homes for morning routines. Janet Morrison, who lived next door, was the first to notice the destruction. She stood in her driveway, coffee mug forgotten in her hand, staring at the empty space where the ramp had been just 12 hours earlier. "Oh my God," Janet whispered, then louder, "Oh my God, Dorothy's ramp is gone." The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. By 8 a.m., a small crowd had gathered on Mrs. Evans' front lawn, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. Patricia Henley drove by twice, slowing each time to observe the reaction, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Inside her home, Mrs. Evans sat in her wheelchair facing the front door, knowing she couldn't open it, couldn't step outside, couldn't even reach her mailbox. The walls seemed to close in around her as the reality of her situation sank in. She was 78 years old, living alone, and now completely dependent on others for anything requiring her to leave the house. Her phone rang at 8:15 a.m. It was Dr. Martinez's office, calling to confirm her appointment for that afternoon, a crucial follow-up after her recent cardiac episode. Mrs. Evans stared at the phone, her voice barely a whisper when she finally answered. "I can't come in today," she said, her words heavy with defeat. "My ramp is gone. I can't get out of my house." The receptionist, confused by this explanation, asked her to repeat herself. "Mrs. Evans found herself explaining the situation, the words sounding surreal even to her own ears. Someone had destroyed her wheelchair ramp during the night. No. She didn't know who. Yes. She was certain it was intentional. Meanwhile, Patricia Henley was at her kitchen table, reviewing HOA bylaws and preparing her defense. She'd been careful to study every regulation, every loophole, every technicality that might protect her from legal consequences. In her mind, she was the defender of property values, the guardian of neighborhood standards, the hero of Willowbrook's aesthetic integrity. Her husband Mark sat across from her, his breakfast untouched, his expression troubled. He'd heard the noise in the early hours, but hadn't realized what his wife was doing until she returned home with wood chips in her hair and satisfaction in her eyes. "Patricia, what have you done?" he asked, his voice quiet, but filled with concern. "That woman needs that ramp. She's disabled. She's a drain on property values," Patricia replied without looking up from her papers. "This neighborhood has standards. If we let one person ignore them, where does it end?" Mark stared at his wife of 22 years, seeing her as if for the first time. The woman he'd married had been ambitious and organized, qualities he'd admired, but somewhere along the way, those traits had curdled into something dark and cruel. By noon, the situation had escalated beyond neighborhood gossip. Someone had called the police, and Officer Sarah Chen arrived to take statements. She stood in Mrs. Evans' living room, her notepad ready, as the elderly woman recounted the night's events. "I heard the noise around 4:45 a.m., Mrs. Evans said, her voice shaking. "Crashing, banging, like someone was tearing something apart. I knew it was my ramp. I just knew." Officer Chen examined the scene outside, noting the clean brake lines where the ramp had been severed from its anchors, the scattered wood chips that Patricia had missed in her hasty cleanup, the tire tracks in the soft earth where a vehicle had been parked. This wasn't random vandalism. This was calculated destruction. The investigation led quickly to Patricia Henley. Her history of complaints about the ramp, her aggressive behavior at HOA meetings, her public statements about unsightly modifications, all pointed in her direction. When Officer Chen knocked on her door at 2 p.m., Patricia was ready with her prepared defense. "I was protecting our neighborhood," Patricia declared, standing in her doorway with arms crossed. "That ramp was an eyesore and a liability. Someone could have been hurt." "Ma'am, did you remove Mrs. Evans' wheelchair ramp without her permission?" Officer Chen asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "I removed a structure that was lowering our property values," Patricia replied. "The HOA has the right to maintain community standards." Officer Chen had dealt with many difficult people in her 15 years on the force, but Patricia's cold indifference to Mrs. Evans' welfare was particularly disturbing. She explained that destroying someone's accessibility equipment was a serious crime, potentially constituting vandalism, harassment, and violation of disability rights. Patricia's confidence faltered slightly as the legal implications were explained to her. She'd focused so intently on HOA regulations that she'd ignored federal disability laws, state property rights, and basic human decency. But she doubled down on her position, convinced that her cause was just. Meanwhile, Mrs. Evans sat in her wheelchair, staring at her front door with growing desperation. The walls of her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She'd lived independently for 78 years, surviving the Great Depression, World War II, raising 3 children as a single mother after her husband's death in Vietnam. She'd never felt as helpless as she did in that moment. Her neighbor Janet Morrison had organized a fundraising effort to rebuild the ramp, but construction would take weeks. maybe months, with permits and inspections. Mrs. Evans had medications that needed monitoring, physical therapy appointments that couldn't be postponed, and a gradually weakening heart that required regular medical attention. The first emergency occurred 3 days after the ramp's destruction. Mrs. Evans woke up feeling dizzy and short of breath, symptoms that had preceded her last cardiac event. She called 911, but when the paramedics arrived, they faced a dilemma. The ambulance gurney couldn't navigate the steps to her front door, and Mrs. Evans couldn't make it to them. The paramedics were forced to carry her out manually, a dangerous and undignified process that left Mrs. Evans humiliated and the medical team frustrated. At the hospital, Dr. Martinez was furious when he learned about the ramp's destruction. "This is unconscionable," he told Mrs. Evans as she lay in the emergency room bed. "Your stress levels are through the roof. This situation is literally making you sick." The doctor's words proved prophetic. Mrs. Evans' blood pressure had spiked dangerously high. Her heart rhythm was irregular, and her overall condition had deteriorated significantly since her last visit. The stress of being trapped in her home, the anxiety about her situation, and the trauma of the ramp's destruction had triggered a cascade of health problems. While Mrs. Evans was hospitalized, the neighborhood rallied around her cause. A petition demanding Patricia Henley's removal from the HOA presidency gathered over 200 signatures in 2 days. Local news stations picked up the story, and the footage of the empty space where the ramp had stood became a symbol of cruelty and intolerance. Patricia found herself increasingly isolated as former friends and neighbors turned against her. Her own family began to distance themselves, embarrassed by her actions and the negative publicity they generated. Her daughter called from college, crying as she begged her mother to apologize and make things right. "Mom, what were you thinking?" her daughter pleaded over the phone. "That poor woman is in the hospital because of what you did. How could you be so cruel?" But Patricia's pride wouldn't allow her to admit wrongdoing. She'd gone too far to back down now, and she convinced herself that the community's reaction was an overreaction to her necessary actions. She hired a lawyer and prepared to fight the charges that were surely coming. The turning point came when Mrs. Evans's son Michael arrived in town. He'd been in Germany on a business trip when the ramp was destroyed, and he'd flown back immediately upon hearing the news. Michael Evans was not just any concerned son. He was a city councilman in Atlanta, with deep connections in local politics and a thorough understanding of disability rights law. Michael stood in his mother's hospital room, looking at the monitoring equipment that tracked her weakening heart, and made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and began making calls to lawyers, to disability rights organizations, to local politicians, to anyone who could help hold Patricia Henley accountable for her actions. "This isn't just about my mother," he told his first contact, a federal prosecutor who specialized in civil rights cases. "This is about every disabled person who depends on accessibility equipment to live independently. If we let this slide, we're telling every HOA Karen in America that they can destroy people's lives without consequences." The call to the federal prosecutor was just the beginning. Michael reached out to the Americans with Disabilities Act Enforcement Office, the State Attorney General's office, and several prominent disability rights organizations. The story of his mother's plight resonated far beyond their small town, becoming a rallying cry for accessibility rights across the country. Within 48 hours, Patricia Henley found herself facing not just local vandalism charges, but federal civil rights violations, disability discrimination complaints, and a civil lawsuit that could bankrupt her family. The media attention intensified, with national news outlets picking up the story and turning Patricia into a symbol of suburban entitlement and cruelty. The pressure mounted on Patricia from all sides. Her employer, an insurance company concerned about their public image, placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the charges. Her homeowner's insurance company threatened to drop her policy due to the liability exposure. Even her own neighbors began openly shunning her. But the worst was yet to come. On a gray Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the ramp's destruction, Mrs. Evans suffered a massive heart attack in her hospital bed. The stress of the situation, combined with her underlying cardiac conditions, had finally overwhelmed her fragile system. The medical team fought to save her, but the damage was too extensive. Dorothy Evans, beloved mother, grandmother, and pillar of the St. Mary's Catholic Church community, passed away at 3:47 p.m. on October 15th, surrounded by her family and the beeping of medical equipment that could no longer sustain her failing heart. The news of Mrs. Evans's death spread through the community like wildfire. What had been a story of harassment and vandalism suddenly became something far more serious. A death that many people directly attributed to Patricia Henley's actions. The stress, the trauma, the humiliation of being trapped in her own home had literally killed her. Michael Evans stood in the hospital hallway, tears streaming down his face as he processed the loss of his mother. But even in his grief, he knew that her death couldn't be in vain. He called his lawyer and uttered the words that would change Patricia Henley's life forever. "I want to press charges for negligent homicide," he said, his voice steady despite his tears. "My mother died because of what that woman did. I want her held accountable." The legal machinery moved quickly. Patricia was arrested at her home on a Tuesday morning, led away in handcuffs as news cameras captured every moment. The charges were serious: negligent homicide, civil rights violations, vandalism, and harassment. If convicted on all counts, she faced up to 20 years in prison. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Patricia's supporters, the few who remained, argued that she couldn't be held responsible for Mrs. Evans' death. But the medical examiner's report painted a different picture. The stress of the situation had directly contributed to the cardiac episode that killed her. The chain of causation was clear. As Patricia sat in jail awaiting trial, unable to make the high bail set by the judge, the community began to organize. Michael Evans announced that there would be a massive rally at City Hall to demand justice for his mother and to call for stronger protections for disabled residents. The rally, scheduled for a Saturday morning in November, drew people from across the state: disability rights activists, concerned citizens, local politicians, and hundreds of people who had been touched by Mrs. Evans's story gathered on the steps of City Hall. The crowd was diverse, young and old, disabled and able-bodied, united in their demand for justice. Michael Evans took the podium, his voice carrying across the crowd through the PA system. He spoke about his mother's life, her struggles, her dignity, and the cruel way it had all ended. He talked about the ramp not as a piece of construction, but as a symbol of independence and human rights. "My mother asked for nothing more than the right to leave her own home," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "She followed every rule, got every permit, respected every regulation, and she died because one person decided that property values were more important than human life." The crowd erupted in applause. But Michael wasn't finished. He announced the formation of the Dorothy Evans Foundation, dedicated to providing free accessibility equipment to disabled residents and fighting for stronger protections against discrimination. He also revealed plans for a class action lawsuit against HOAs across the country that had similar discriminatory policies. The rally made national news, with footage of the crowd and Michael's speech broadcast across the country. The story resonated with millions of people who had faced similar struggles with bureaucracy, discrimination, and indifference. Mrs. Evans became a symbol of dignity in the face of cruelty. and Patricia Henley became the face of everything wrong with suburban entitlement. Patricia's trial began in January, and the courtroom was packed every day. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman so obsessed with appearances that she was willing to destroy another person's life to maintain them. Witness after witness testified about Patricia's campaign of harassment against Mrs. Evans, her cruel comments about disabled people, and her complete lack of remorse. The most damaging testimony came from Patricia's own husband, Mark, who had finally found the courage to speak out against his wife's actions. He testified about the night of the ramp's destruction, about Patricia's planning and preparation, and about her satisfaction afterward. She was proud of what she'd done, Mark testified, his voice barely audible. She thought she was protecting the neighborhood. She never once considered what it would do to Mrs. Evans. The defense tried to argue that Patricia couldn't be held responsible for Mrs. Evans' death, that the elderly woman's heart condition was a pre-existing condition that would have killed her anyway. But the prosecution's medical experts testified that the stress of the situation had directly contributed to her cardiac episode. The destruction of the ramp had set in motion a chain of events that led directly to her death. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Patricia Henley was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 7 years. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke about the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. Mrs. Henley, your actions demonstrated a callous disregard for human life and dignity. The judge said, you destroyed not just a ramp, but a woman's independence, her health, and ultimately her life. Society must be protected from this kind of cruelty. Patricia's conviction sent ripples through HOA communities across the country. Many organizations quietly revised their policies regarding accessibility equipment, fearing similar legal challenges. The Patricia Henley case became a cautionary tale taught in law schools and used by disability rights advocates to push for stronger protections. But the story didn't end with Patricia's conviction. The community of Willowbrook, shaken by the tragedy and determined to honor Mrs. Evans' memory, embarked on an ambitious project. Using donations from the rally and grants from the Dorothy Evans Foundation, they began installing accessibility ramps, widening sidewalks, and adding curb cuts throughout the neighborhood. The transformation was remarkable. Within 6 months, Willowbrook had become one of the most accessible communities in the state. The project attracted national attention, with urban planners and disability advocates visiting to study their methods. The neighborhood that had been the site of such cruelty became a model of inclusion and community support. Michael Evans returned to Atlanta, but kept his promise to his mother's memory. The Dorothy Evans Foundation grew rapidly, funded by donations from across the country. They provided free accessibility equipment to thousands of disabled residents, funded legal challenges to discriminatory HOA policies, and lobbied for stronger federal protections. The Foundation's first major victory came when Congress passed the Dorothy Evans Act, which strengthened penalties for disability discrimination and provided federal funding for accessibility improvements in residential communities. The law was signed by the President in a ceremony attended by Michael and several of his mother's former neighbors. Mrs. Evans' former home was purchased by the Foundation and converted into a resource center for disabled residents. The empty space where her ramp had stood was transformed into a memorial garden, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Dorothy Evans, who asked only for the right to leave her own home." May we never forget that dignity and accessibility are not luxuries, but fundamental human rights. The Memorial Garden became a place of pilgrimage for disability rights advocates and a symbol of the community's commitment to inclusion. Visitors from around the world came to pay their respects and learn about the transformation that had taken place in Willowbrook. Patricia Henley served her sentence in a federal prison, where she was required to participate in community service programs and sensitivity training. For the first time in her life, she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions and the pain she had caused. It was a slow and difficult process, but eventually, she began to understand the magnitude of what she had done. Her husband, Mark, divorced her while she was in prison, taking their daughter and moving to another state to escape the notoriety. He testified at parole hearings, arguing that Patricia still hadn't fully accepted responsibility for her actions. Her applications for early parole were denied twice. When Patricia was finally released after serving her full sentence, she emerged into a world that had changed dramatically. The Dorothy Evans Act had reshaped how communities approached accessibility, and her name had become synonymous with the worst impulses of suburban entitlement. She found work as a night shift cleaner, a far cry from her former position as an insurance executive. On the 5th anniversary of Mrs. Evans's death, Michael returned to Willowbrook for the annual memorial service. The community had grown and changed, but the memory of his mother remained strong. New families had moved in, including several with disabled members who benefited from the accessibility improvements. As Michael stood in the memorial garden, reading the names of the hundreds of people who had been helped by the foundation, he felt a sense of peace. His mother's death had been a tragedy, but it had also sparked a movement that had improved the lives of thousands of disabled people across the country. The Dorothy Evans Foundation continued to grow, expanding its mission to include not just accessibility equipment, but also legal advocacy, community education, and policy reform. The Foundation's annual report showed that they had helped install over 10,000 accessibility ramps, funded 500 legal challenges to discriminatory policies, and trained thousands of HOA board members on disability rights. In schools across the country, Mrs. Evans's story was taught as part of civics and social studies curricula. Students learned about the importance of standing up for vulnerable community members and the devastating consequences of unchecked prejudice. The story resonated particularly strongly with young people, who organized fundraisers and volunteer projects to support disability rights. The house where Mrs. Evans had lived, now the Foundation's Resource Center, bustled with activity. Volunteers helped disabled residents navigate bureaucratic processes, apply for grants, and connect with resources. The center also served as a meeting place for support groups and advocacy organizations. Janet Morrison, Mrs. Evans' former neighbor, had become the center's director. She often thought about that morning when she discovered the destroyed ramp, and how it had changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone in the community. She'd left her corporate job to work for the foundation full-time, finding more meaning in helping others than she'd ever found in her previous career. The annual Dorothy Evans Memorial Walk became one of the largest disability rights events in the state. Participants walked through the streets of Willowbrook, past the Memorial Garden, and on to the Resource Center. The walk raised money for the foundation and served as a reminder of how far the community had come. As the years passed, the story of Mrs. Evans and Patricia Henley became a case study in law schools, business schools, and public policy programs. It was cited in Supreme Court cases, referenced in congressional hearings, and used by advocates to argue for stronger protections for disabled people. The transformation of Willowbrook was held up as a model for other communities. Urban planners studied their methods, and the federal government provided grants to replicate their accessibility improvements in other neighborhoods. The community that had once been the site of such cruelty became a beacon of hope and inclusion. Patricia Henley, now in her 60s and living in a small apartment across the state, occasionally saw news reports about the foundation or the memorial events. She'd finally begun to understand the depth of the pain she'd caused and the magnitude of the movement her actions had sparked. She'd written letters of apology to Michael Evans and the community, though she'd never received responses. On the 10th anniversary of Mrs. Evans' death, Michael Evans published a book about his mother's life and the movement that had grown from her death. The book, titled The Ramp, A Story of Dignity, Community, and Justice, became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary that won several awards. The book's final chapter was titled Dorothy's Legacy, and it chronicled the thousands of lives that had been improved by the Foundation's work. Michael wrote about disabled children who could now attend school because of accessible transportation, elderly residents who could remain in their homes because of accessibility modifications, and communities that had become more welcoming and inclusive. The Dorothy Evans Foundation had grown from a small memorial fund into a major national organization with chapters in all 50 states. They'd successfully lobbied for stronger federal protections, funded thousands of accessibility improvements, and changed the conversation about disability rights in America. As Michael stood once again in the memorial garden, now surrounded by his own children and grandchildren, he reflected on the journey from tragedy to triumph. His mother had lived a quiet life, asking for nothing more than the right to leave her own home. Her death had been a tragedy, but from that tragedy had grown a movement that had transformed communities across the country. The memorial garden was fuller now, with additional plaques honoring other disability rights pioneers and victims of discrimination. But Mrs. Evans' plaque remained at the center, its message as relevant as ever. May we never forget that dignity and accessibility are not luxuries, but fundamental human rights. The sun set over Willowbrook, casting long shadows across the memorial garden and the accessible pathways that now crisscross the neighborhood. The community had been forever changed by the events of that terrible week, but from the ashes of cruelty had risen something beautiful, a commitment to inclusion, dignity, and the radical idea that every person deserves the right to participate fully in their community. Mrs. Dorothy Evans had asked only for a ramp, a simple wooden structure that would allow her to leave her home with dignity. What she received instead was immortality, her name forever associated with the fight for accessibility and inclusion. The ramp was gone, destroyed by hatred and intolerance, but its spirit lived on in every accessible building, every curb cut, every community that chose inclusion over exclusion. The story of the ramp had become larger than any one person or community. It was a reminder that small acts of cruelty can have devastating consequences, but also that from the darkest moments can emerge the brightest lights. Dorothy Evans had died seeking nothing more than the right to leave her own home. In death, she had given millions of people the right to full participation in their communities. The legacy lived on, not just in the foundation that bore her name or the laws that protected disabled people, but in every act of kindness, every moment of inclusion, every time someone chose dignity over prejudice. The ramp had been destroyed, but what it represented, the fundamental right to accessibility and dignity, had become unshakable. And in the memorial garden, as the evening breeze rustled through the trees and visitors from around the world came to pay their respects, the message remained clear. Never again would a community allow cruelty to triumph over compassion. Never again would aesthetic preferences override human rights. And never again would someone be trapped in their own home by the hatred of others. The ramp was gone, but its spirit was eternal. Dorothy Evans had found her voice not in life, but in death. And that voice continued to speak for millions of people who simply wanted the right to participate fully in their communities. The transformation was complete. The victory was permanent, and the legacy would endure forever. From the destruction of a simple wooden ramp had grown a movement that changed the world. From the death of one elderly woman had come life and hope for millions. From the darkest moment of cruelty had emerged the brightest light of justice. The story of Dorothy Evans and her ramp would live on, a testament to the power of community, the importance of dignity, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to be defeated by hatred.